The smoking ruins of New York City stretched endlessly under the alien sky. Where once the Empire State Building had touched the clouds, now only twisted metal and broken dreams remained. The Zephyrian Empire's massive warships hovered above like dark storm clouds, their blue energy shields casting an eerie glow over the devastated landscape. Commander Vexitar stood on the observation deck of his flagship, watching the last pockets of human resistance crumble below, his forearms crossed behind his back in satisfaction, while his crystalline eyes reflected the fires burning in what humans had once called Manhattan. The conquest of Earth had taken exactly 47 standard hours. Not bad for a species that had once dared to send radio signals into space, practically begging to be found. "Status report," Vexitar commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had conquered 17 worlds before this insignificant blue marble. His aide, Lieutenant Krell-Esch, consulted the holographic display floating before him. "Sir, human military resistance has dropped to less than 2%. Their governments have either surrendered or ceased to exist. The primitive weapons they called nuclear missiles were neutralized before they could leave their atmosphere." Vexitar nodded, unsurprised. Humans were just another species in a long list of conquered civilizations. They followed the same predictable pattern. Initial shock, desperate resistance, then inevitable surrender when faced with superior technology. The Zephyrian Empire had perfected this process over the course of 2,000 years. "What about their population centers?" Vexitar asked. "Secured, sir. The major cities are under occupation. We estimate civilian casualties at roughly 8% of their global population, well within acceptable parameters for a standard conquest operation." "Excellent. And their leaders?" "Most have been captured or eliminated. We've established provisional governors in each major territory. The human workforce will be processed for labor assignments within the next planetary rotation." Vexitar turned away from the window, his mind already moving to the next phase of occupation. Humans would join the ranks of the other subject species, mining precious metals in the asteroid belts, maintaining agricultural worlds, serving as basic laborers in the Empire's vast industrial complex. It was the natural order of things. The strong ruled, the weak served. But deep beneath the city, in the abandoned subway tunnels that honeycombed Manhattan's underground, something stirred that the Empire's sensors hadn't detected. Something that didn't fit their carefully calculated models of conquest and submission. Sergeant Jake Morrison crouched in the darkness, his military fatigues torn and dirty, his face streaked with soot and dried blood that wasn't all his own. Around him, a small group of survivors huddled in the abandoned train car they'd converted into a makeshift shelter. There were maybe 30 of them left from his entire unit. The 82nd Airborne had been wiped out in the first wave of attacks. The aliens had been thorough. They'd targeted military installations first, then government buildings, then communication networks. Within hours, Earth's entire command structure had collapsed like a house of cards. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that destroying the command structure would destroy human resistance entirely. Jake checked his rifle for the 100th time, though ammunition was running dangerously low. Around him, the other survivors sat in stunned silence. Most were civilians who'd fled into the tunnels when the bombing started. A few were other soldiers who'd managed to escape the initial assault. There was Maria Santos, a firefighter from Brooklyn, Tom Chen, a construction worker who knew these tunnels better than anyone, Sarah Williams, a nurse who'd been treating their wounded with supplies scavenged from destroyed medical facilities. "Sarge," whispered Private Collins, a kid who looked like he'd barely graduated high school. "What are we gonna do? I mean, they got spaceships and energy weapons and—" His voice trailed off. Jake looked at the young soldier, remembering his own grandfather's stories about World War II, about how ordinary people had done extraordinary things when their backs were against the wall, about how Americans had learned to fight a different kind of war in the Pacific Islands, adapting and innovating when conventional tactics failed. "We're going to remind them of something they forgot." "Collins," Jake said quietly. "What's that, Sarge?" Jake's eyes hardened as he stared toward the ceiling, where he knew the alien ships waited in the sky above. That humans don't surrender. We adapt, we improvise, we overcome, and we never, ever give up. Above them, Commander Vexitar was receiving another report. The human military had officially ceased to exist. Their governments had fallen. Their major cities were occupied. According to every model the Zephyrian Empire had developed over centuries of conquest, the war was over. But in the darkness below, Jake Morrison was cleaning his weapon and planning the next phase of a war that the Empire didn't even know had begun. Because while they'd studied human governments and human militaries and human technologies, they'd never bothered to study the human spirit. They'd never learned about Valley, Forge or Stalingrad or Iwo Jima. They'd never heard the stories passed, down from generation to generation about ordinary people who'd refused to quit when quitting was the only logical option. The Empire thought they'd won because they'd applied the same formula that had worked on 17 other worlds. Superior firepower plus overwhelming numbers plus the destruction of command structures equals conquest. It was a mathematical certainty. What they didn't understand was that humans had never been particularly good at math when it came to knowing when they were beaten. And Jake Morrison, along with thousands of other survivors scattered across the planet, was about to give them a very practical education in why underestimating human stubbornness was a fatal mistake. The real war was just beginning. 3 weeks after the conquest, Commander Vextar was beginning to feel the first stirrings of unease. The occupation of Earth was proceeding according to schedule, but small irregularities had begun appearing in the reports from his field commanders. Nothing significant, just minor anomalies that didn't quite fit the expected pattern. "Sir," Lieutenant Krelesh approached with another stack of digital reports. "We've had 17 more incidents in the past rotation." Vextar's crystalline eyes narrowed. "Define incidents." "Supply convoy attacks, sir. Small groups of humans emerging from concealment, striking our transport vehicles, then vanishing before reinforcements arrive. They're using primitive projectile weapons and improvised explosives. Casualties? Minimal on our side, sir. Perhaps a dozen wounded, 3 dead. But they're disrupting supply lines to the mining operations." Vextar dismissed the concern with a wave of one of his 4 arms. Predictable insurgent activity. "Every conquered species goes through this phase. Deploy additional security units and increase patrol frequencies. The problem will resolve itself within a lunar cycle." But deep in the tunnel systems beneath Manhattan, Jake Morrison was learning that the Zephyrians had made their second mistake. They'd assumed that human military doctrine was limited to what they'd observed in the brief, conventional war that had ended Earth's organized resistance. Jake knelt beside a makeshift table constructed from subway bench seats, studying crude maps drawn on salvaged paper. Tom Chen, the construction worker, had provided detailed schematics of the tunnel systems. Sarah Williams had identified which abandoned buildings still had functional utilities. Maria Santos had mapped out the patrol patterns of alien security forces. "They move in groups of 4, Maria reported, her firefighters training making her a natural scout. Same routes, same timing every day. Very predictable. Their vehicles are heavily armored," Tom added, "but they follow the main roads. They haven't figured out that half the city's infrastructure runs underground." Jake nodded, studying the patterns. The Zephyrians were military professionals, but they were fighting the last war, the one they'd already won. They'd prepared for human armies with tanks and fighter jets and conventional tactics. They hadn't prepared for what humans did best, adapt to impossible situations and turn disadvantages into weapons. "Collins," Jake called to the young private. "How many of those improvised charges did you and Henderson finish?" 8, Sarge, but we're running low on materials." "Sarah, what about medical supplies?" The nurse looked up from her makeshift aid station. "We've got enough antibiotics and painkillers for maybe another week. After that," she shrugged. Jake understood the implications. They were living on borrowed time, scavenging what they could from the ruins above. But that wasn't the point. The point was to make the occupiers understand that controlling the surface didn't mean controlling the planet. "All right, listen up," Jake addressed the group. "Tonight we hit the supply depot on Canal Street. Tom's found a service tunnel that comes up right behind their perimeter. We go in fast, grab what we can, and disappear before they know what hit them." Private Collins raised his hand nervously. "Sarge, what if they capture one of us? What if they interrogate, then we don't get captured?" Jake cut him off. "And if we do, we remember that we're buying time for everyone else who's still fighting. Every day we keep them busy down here is another day for other survivors to organize, to find weapons, to figure out their weaknesses." What Jake didn't know was that similar conversations were taking place in basements and caves and abandoned buildings all across the planet. In the mountains of Afghanistan, former Taliban fighters were teaching American soldiers the art of guerrilla warfare against an occupying force. In the Amazon rainforest, Brazilian special forces were learning jungle tactics from indigenous tribes who'd been avoiding outsiders for centuries. In the Australian outback, ranchers and aboriginals were working together to harass alien mining operations. The Zephyrians had conquered Earth's governments and militaries, but they'd never encountered anything like the human capacity for spite-driven creativity. They'd studied human warfare through the lens of conventional conflicts between nation-states. They'd never imagined that humans might respond to overwhelming odds by simply refusing to acknowledge those odds as relevant. That night, Jake's team struck the Canal Street depot. They emerged from a storm drain like ghosts, overwhelmed the two alien guard detail in seconds, and vanished into the tunnels with enough supplies to keep their cell operational for another month. By the time Zephyrian reinforcements arrived, they found nothing but empty streets and a few scorch marks on the pavement. But they left something behind that the aliens didn't notice until morning. Graffiti spray painted on the side of their supply building. A message in English that their translation computers rendered as "Earth still fights." Commander Vexitar stared at the translated message, his mandibles clicking with irritation. It was meaningless bravado from a defeated species, nothing more. But something about the simple declaration bothered him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. "Sir?" Lieutenant Kralesh interrupted his thoughts. "We've received similar reports from occupation forces on all 7 continents. The insurgent activity appears to be coordinated." "Impossible," Vexitar snapped. "We've destroyed their communication networks. There's no way scattered human survivors could coordinate planet-wide operations." But even as he said it, Vexitar realized the flaw in his reasoning. The Empire had destroyed human electronic communications, but they'd underestimated something far more primitive and far more dangerous: the human ability to inspire others through example. Every successful raid, every supply convoy that failed to arrive, every patrol that reported harassment from invisible enemies, it all sent the same message to other human survivors. Resistance was possible. Hope was alive. The war wasn't over. Jake Morrison didn't know that his small cell's actions were part of a growing worldwide pattern. He was just a soldier doing what soldiers do, adapting to the situation and completing the mission. But his mission had expanded beyond simple survival. Now it was about proving to an arrogant empire that they'd forgotten the most important rule of warfare: never underestimate your enemies' willingness to make your victory more expensive than you're prepared to pay. 2 months into the occupation, the Zephyrian Empire was learning that conquering a planet and controlling it were 2 very different things. What had begun as isolated incidents of human insurgency had evolved into something far more troubling: a coordinated campaign of asymmetric warfare that seemed to anticipate their every move. Commander Vexitar stood before the holographic display in his war room, watching red indicators multiply across Earth's surface like a spreading infection. Each marker represented a successful attack on Empire forces or infrastructure. The pattern was unmistakable and deeply disturbing. "Report," he commanded, his forearms tense with barely controlled frustration. Captain Zorak, his chief of operations, manipulated the display to focus on the North American continent. "Sir, in the past week alone we've lost 12 supply convoys, 2 mining facilities, and a communications relay station. Similar patterns are emerging on every continent. Casualties: 143 personnel dead or missing. 317 wounded. More concerning, sir, is the sophisticated nature of these attacks. The humans are demonstrating tactical knowledge that shouldn't be possible for scattered survivors." Vexitar studied the display more carefully. The attacks weren't random. They followed a clear strategic pattern, targeting supply lines, communication nodes, and isolated outposts while carefully avoiding heavily defended positions. It was the kind of coordinated strategy that required central command and advanced intelligence gathering. "How are they communicating?" he demanded. "We've destroyed every satellite, every communication tower, every network hub on this planet." Captain Zorak hesitated before answering. "We believe they're using primitive methods, sir. Radio equipment scavenged from vehicles, coded messages left in physical locations, even runners carrying information between cells." "Runners?" Vexitar's voice dripped with disdain. "You're telling me that in the age of quantum entanglement communication, we're being outmaneuvered by humans carrying messages on foot?" Deep beneath the ruins of Manhattan, Jake Morrison was proving exactly how effective those primitive methods could be. His cell had grown from 30 survivors to over 100, spread across a network of connected tunnel systems that stretched from Central Park to the Brooklyn Bridge. More importantly, they'd established contact with similar groups throughout the metropolitan area. Intel from the Bronx cell confirms it, Maria Santos reported, having just returned from a dangerous overland journey to meet with another resistance group. The aliens are pulling security forces from the outer boroughs to reinforce Midtown. They're getting nervous. Jake studied the hand-drawn map spread across their makeshift table. Red marks indicated confirmed alien positions. Blue marks showed known resistance cells. Green marks highlighted potential targets. What emerged was a picture of a city where the occupiers controlled the surface during daylight hours, but lost control completely after dark. "Sarah, how are our medical supplies?" he asked. The nurse looked up from treating a wounded fighter who'd been injured in the previous night's raid. "Better than expected. We hit that alien medical supply transport last week, and their equipment is actually superior to what we used to have. I've got enough supplies now to set up 3 more field hospitals." That was the strange thing about fighting the Zephyrians. Their technology was undeniably advanced, but it was also standardized across their entire empire. They'd never had to deal with opponents who could adapt their equipment for completely different purposes. Human ingenuity was turning their own supplies against them. Tom Chen looked up from the explosive device he was constructing. "Jake, you need to see this." Henderson figured out how to reprogram one of their supply drones. Private Henderson, who'd been a computer programmer before the invasion, grinned as he showed Jake a small Zephyrian device covered in human-made modifications. "I can't control it perfectly, but I can make it report false inventory data to their central command. As far as they know, this drone is delivering supplies to a depot that doesn't exist." Jake felt a familiar surge of pride in human adaptability. The Zephyrians had superior weapons, superior armor, superior ships, but they'd designed all of it for fighting other high-tech civilizations. They'd never imagined facing an enemy that would steal their lunch and then use the lunchbox to build a bomb. "Collins," Jake called to the young private, "take Henderson's drone intel and coordinate with the Brooklyn cell. If we can manipulate their supply data, we can predict where their next convoys will be." But the resistance wasn't just about tactics and supply raids anymore. It was becoming something the Zephyrians had never encountered in their 2,000 years of conquest. A war of morale and ideology. Every successful human attack sent a message to both sides. To the scattered human survivors, it proved that the invaders weren't invincible. To the Zephyrian occupiers, it demonstrated that their overwhelming technological advantage meant nothing if they couldn't find their enemy. The Yaosei graffiti that had started as simple messages of defiance, "Earth still fights, Ahmed," evolved into complex underground communication networks. Coded symbols spray-painted on building walls told other resistance cells about patrol routes, supply schedules, and safe houses. The aliens could destroy the messages, but new ones appeared faster than they could be erased. Commander Vextar was beginning to understand that he was fighting a different kind of war than anything in Zephyrian military doctrine. His forces controlled territory, but the humans controlled the population. His technology was superior, but the humans were making it irrelevant through tactics his strategists had never considered. "Sir," Lieutenant Kralesh approached with yet another troubling report. "We've intercepted human communications suggesting they're calling this conflict something different than we are." "Explain." "They don't refer to it as a post-conquest insurgency, sir. They call it the resistance or the war for liberation. They appear to believe the conflict is still ongoing, not that they've already lost." Vextar stared at his aide in disbelief. "They know their military was destroyed. They know their governments have fallen. They know their cities are under occupation. How can they believe they haven't lost?" What the commander didn't understand was that humans had a completely different definition of victory and defeat than any species the Empire had previously encountered. The Zephyrians measured success in terms of territory controlled and enemy forces destroyed. Humans measured success in terms of whether they were still fighting. As long as Jake Morrison and thousands like him continued to plant bombs, steal supplies, and spray defiant messages on walls, the war wasn't over. It had just entered a phase that the Galactic Empire had never learned how to win. The Empire had conquered Earth in 47 hours. But they were slowly discovering that conquering Earth and defeating humanity were 2 entirely different objectives, and they'd only accomplished one of them. 2 months into the occupation, the Zephyrian Empire was learning that conquering a planet and controlling it were two very different things. What had begun as isolated incidents of human insurgency had evolved into something far more troubling, a coordinated campaign of asymmetric warfare that seemed to anticipate their every move. Commander Vexitar stood before the holographic display in his war room, watching red indicators multiply across Earth's surface like a spreading infection. Each marker represented a successful attack on Empire forces or infrastructure. The pattern was unmistakable and deeply disturbing. "Report," he commanded, his forearms tense with barely controlled frustration. Captain Zorak, his chief of operations, manipulated the display to focus on the North American continent. "Sir, in the past week alone we've lost 12 supply convoys, 2 mining facilities, and a communications relay station. Similar patterns are emerging on every continent. Casualties: 143 personnel dead or missing. 317 wounded. More concerning, sir, is the sophisticated nature of these attacks. The humans are demonstrating tactical knowledge that shouldn't be possible for scattered survivors." Vexitar studied the display more carefully. The attacks weren't random. They followed a clear strategic pattern, targeting supply lines, communication nodes, and isolated outposts, while carefully avoiding heavily defended positions. It was the kind of coordinated strategy that required central command and advanced intelligence gathering. "How are they communicating?" he demanded. "We've destroyed every satellite, every communication tower, every network hub on this planet." Captain Zorak hesitated before answering. "We believe they're using primitive methods, sir. Radio equipment scavenged from vehicles, coded messages left in physical locations, even runners carrying information between cells." "Runners?" Vexitar's voice dripped with disdain. "You're telling me that in the age of quantum entanglement communication, we're being outmaneuvered by humans carrying messages on foot?" Deep beneath the ruins of Manhattan, Jake Morrison was proving exactly how effective those primitive methods could be. His cell had grown from 30 survivors to over 100, spread across a network of connected tunnel systems that stretched from Central Park to the Brooklyn Bridge. More importantly, they'd established contact with similar groups throughout the metropolitan area. "Intel from the Bronx cell confirms it," Maria Santos reported, having just returned from a dangerous overland journey to meet with another resistance group. "The aliens are pulling security forces from the outer boroughs to reinforce Midtown." "They're getting nervous." Jake studied the hand-drawn map spread across their makeshift table. Red marks indicated confirmed alien positions. Blue marks showed known resistance cells. Green marks highlighted potential targets. What emerged was a picture of a city where the occupiers controlled the surface during daylight hours, but lost control completely after dark. "Sarah, how are our medical supplies?" he asked. The nurse looked up from treating a wounded fighter who'd been injured in the previous night's raid. "Better than expected. We hit that alien medical supply transport last week, and their equipment is actually superior to what we used to have. I've got enough supplies now to set up 3 more field hospitals." That was the strange thing about fighting the Zephyrians. Their technology was undeniably advanced, but it was also standardized across their entire empire. They'd never had to deal with opponents who could adapt their equipment for completely different purposes. Human ingenuity was turning their own supplies against them. Tom Chen looked up from the explosive device he was constructing. "Jake, you need to see this." Henderson figured out how to reprogram one of their supply drones. Private Henderson, who'd been a computer programmer before the invasion, grinned as he showed Jake a small Zephyrian device covered in human-made modifications. "I can't control it perfectly, but I can make it report false inventory data to their central command. As far as they know, this drone is delivering supplies to a depot that doesn't exist." Jake felt a familiar surge of pride in human adaptability. The Zephyrians had superior weapons, superior armor, superior ships, but they'd designed all of it for fighting other high-tech civilizations. They'd never imagined facing an enemy that would steal their lunch and then use the lunchbox to build a bomb. "Collins," Jake called to the young private, "take Henderson's drone intel and coordinate with the Brooklyn cell. If we can manipulate their supply data, we can predict where their next convoys will be." But the resistance wasn't just about tactics and supply raids anymore. It was becoming something the Zephyrians had never encountered in their 2,000 years of conquest. A war of morale and ideology. Every successful human attack sent a message to both sides. To the scattered human survivors, it proved that the invaders weren't invincible. To the Zephyrian occupiers, it demonstrated that their overwhelming technological advantage meant nothing if they couldn't find their enemy. The Yaosei graffiti that had started as simple messages of defiance, Earth still fights, Ahmed, evolved into complex underground communication networks. Coded symbols spray-painted on building walls told other resistance cells about patrol routes, supply schedules, and safe houses. The aliens could destroy the messages, but new ones appeared faster than they could be erased. Commander Vextar was beginning to understand that he was fighting a different kind of war than anything in Zephyrian military doctrine. His forces controlled territory, but the humans controlled the population. His technology was superior, but the humans were making it irrelevant through tactics his strategists had never considered. Sir, Lieutenant Kralesh approached with yet another troubling report. We've intercepted human communication suggesting they're calling this conflict something different than we are. Explain. They don't refer to it as a post-conquest insurgency, sir. They call it the resistance or the war for liberation. They appear to believe the conflict is still ongoing, not that they've already lost. Vextar stared at his aide in disbelief. They know their military was destroyed. They know their governments have fallen. They know their cities are under occupation. How can they believe they haven't lost? What the commander didn't understand was that humans had a completely different definition of victory and defeat than any species the Empire had previously encountered. The Zephyrians measured success in terms of territory controlled and enemy forces destroyed. Humans measured success in terms of whether they were still fighting. As long as Jake Morrison and thousands like him continued to plant bombs, steal supplies, and spray defiant messages on walls, the war wasn't over. It had just entered a phase that the Galactic Empire had never learned how to win. The Empire had conquered Earth in 47 hours. But they were slowly discovering that conquering Earth and defeating humanity were two entirely different objectives, and they'd only accomplished one of them. 6 months after the invasion, Commander Vextar found himself in the unprecedented position of requesting reinforcements for what should have been a simple occupation mission. The holographic communication from High Command flickered with the disapproving image of Admiral Tissavar, whose ancient crystalline features showed the kind of irritation reserved for incompetent subordinates. Explain to me, Commander, how a primitive world that surrendered in less than 2 planetary rotations now requires an additional battle fleet to maintain control. The Admiral's voice carried across the void with barely contained disgust. Vextar straightened his forearms, knowing his career hung in the balance. Sir, the humans have proven to be tactically unpredictable. They don't follow conventional patterns of post-conquest behavior. Elaborate. They appear to view the destruction of their formal military as merely the end of Phase 1 of their resistance. Instead of accepting defeat, they've transitioned to what they call guerrilla warfare. Our occupation forces are taking significant casualties. Admiral Tissavar's image leaned forward menacingly. Commander, the Zephyrian Empire has conquered 17 worlds. We have never required additional forces to suppress post-conquest insurgencies. Are you telling me that primitive humans are more dangerous than the crystal warriors of Vega Prime or the hive minds of the Centauri system? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Vextar had fought in both of those campaigns. The crystal warriors had been physically superior to any Zephyrian soldier, and the hive minds had possessed telepathic coordination that made them nearly impossible to surprise. But both species had followed logical patterns of warfare that could be analyzed, predicted, and countered. Humans, apparently, specialized in being illogical. Sir, the humans have demonstrated capabilities that our intelligence reports failed to identify, Vextar finally answered. They've established communication networks using technology we thought we'd eliminated. They've created supply chains using our own resources. Most significantly, they've coordinated resistance across their entire planet without any centralized command structure that we can identify and eliminate. That's impossible, Commander. No species can coordinate planet-wide operations without detectable communication networks. But even as Admiral Tissavar spoke, Jake Morrison was proving exactly how possible it was. In the abandoned warehouse in what used to be Detroit, he stood before a gathering that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Former enemies now working together with the singular goal of making the Zephyrian occupation as expensive as possible. The Colonel's plan is ambitious, Jake addressed the group. which included everyone from former gang leaders to retired military officers to college professors. But it's also our best shot at moving from harassment to actual victory. Colonel Hayes stepped forward, her bearing still military despite the improvised uniform and months of underground living. The aliens think like a traditional military force. They understand territorial control, force projection, and resource management. What they don't understand is that humans have been fighting asymmetric warfare for thousands of years. She activated a hand-drawn diagram that showed the major alien installations across North America. They've concentrated their forces at strategic points, major cities, resource extraction sites, and transportation hubs. It's textbook occupation doctrine, which means they've created exactly the kind of targets we need. Maria Santos raised her hand. Colonel, our intelligence suggests they're bringing in reinforcements. Our raids are hurting them, but they're adapting too. That's exactly what we want, Hayes replied with a smile that would have made a Zephyrian strategist nervous if they'd understood its implications. Every soldier they bring to Earth is a soldier they can't use somewhere else. Every resource they spend on pacification operations is a resource they can't spend on expanding their empire. Tom Chen, now commanding a network of urban warfare specialists, added his own observation. They're also learning our tactics, but they're learning the wrong lessons. They think we're trying to drive them off the planet through direct confrontation. What are we actually trying to do? Asked Private Collins, who'd grown from nervous kid to seasoned demolitions expert over the months of fighting. Colonel Hayes's smile widened. We're trying to teach them that occupying Earth costs more than they're willing to pay, and we're about to give them a very expensive education. The plan she outlined over the next 2 hours was audacious even by human standards. Instead of continuing the scattered raids and supply disruptions that had characterized the resistance so far, they were going to attempt something that no conquered species had ever tried. A coordinated offensive designed not to recapture territory, but to demonstrate that the cost of holding Earth exceeded the value of possessing it. Meanwhile, aboard the Zephyrian flagship, Admiral Thisavar was reviewing intelligence reports that challenged everything the Empire thought it knew about conquest and occupation. Commander, these casualty reports are unacceptable, the Admiral said after reviewing the data. We've lost more personnel in 6 months of pacification than we did in the entire conquest of the Rigel colonies. Yes, sir. The humans have proven remarkably adept at what they call asymmetric warfare. They avoid direct confrontation with our superior forces while targeting our logistical vulnerabilities, then eliminate their ability to conduct such operations, increase security around all supply lines, double the guard details at strategic installations, implement more aggressive population screening. Vextar hesitated before responding. Sir, we've already implemented all of those measures. The humans adapt their tactics faster than we can adjust our countermeasures. When we increase security in one area, they shift their attacks to another. When we change our patrol patterns, they observe the changes and develop new approaches. Admiral Thisavar studied his subordinate with growing concern. In 2,000 years of expansion, the Zephyrian Empire had never encountered a species that improved its military effectiveness after being defeated. Most civilizations collapsed into despair and collaboration once their formal military structures were eliminated. The humans, incomprehensibly, seemed to view the destruction of their conventional forces as a liberation from conventional tactics. Sir, Vextar continued, there's something else. Our intelligence division has been analyzing human historical records. They've discovered that this species has a documented tradition of defeating superior enemies through persistence and adaptation. Impossible. No primitive species can consistently overcome technological superiority. The humans have done it repeatedly throughout their history, sir. They call it leveling the playing field. When facing enemies with better weapons, they develop better tactics. When facing enemies with superior numbers, they use superior terrain knowledge. When facing enemies with advanced technology, they steal that technology and turn it against its creators. Admiral Thisavar felt something that no Zephyrian commander had experienced in centuries of conquest, the beginning of doubt. Are you telling me, Commander, that we've invaded a world populated by natural guerrilla fighters? Before Vextar could answer, the communication was interrupted by urgent alerts from the bridge. Multiple coordinated attacks were beginning across every continent simultaneously. The humans weren't just raiding individual targets anymore. They were conducting military operations with strategic objectives. And in the abandoned warehouse in Detroit, Colonel Patricia Hayes was about to teach the Galactic Empire why Rule Number 1 existed in the first place. The attack began at exactly 0300 hours across every time zone on Earth. Jake Morrison crouched in a storm drain beneath the Zephyrian Command Complex in Manhattan, listening to the distant sounds of explosions echoing across the city. Similar attacks were happening in London, Tokyo, Sydney, Cairo, São Paulo, and dozens of other cities simultaneously. Phase 1 complete, Maria Santos whispered into her improvised radio. All primary targets confirmed hit. Jake checked his weapon and nodded to his team. Tom Chen had mapped every utility tunnel and maintenance shaft in the area. Henderson had hacked into the alien security systems and created a 30-minute window where their sensors would report false readings. Collins had prepared enough explosives to level half the building above them, but destroying the building wasn't the objective. Teaching the Empire a lesson was. Remember, Jake addressed his team, we're not here to win a conventional battle. We're here to demonstrate something the Empire has never seen before. They emerged from the tunnel system like ghosts, moving through the alien complex with the precision of soldiers who'd spent months studying their enemy's habits. The Zephyrian guards were professional and well-equipped, but they were trained to fight other professional militaries. They'd never learned to fight people who refused to follow military conventions. Jake's team bypassed the heavily defended main entrances and emerged through bathroom ventilation systems. They avoided the strategic command centers and targeted the cafeteria, the sleeping quarters, and the maintenance areas where off-duty personnel felt safe. They didn't try to capture territory or destroy critical infrastructure. Instead, they planted explosives, graffitied messages, and then vanished before reinforcements could respond. The message they left behind was simple but profound. You can't be safe anywhere on our planet. But the real lesson was being taught 3 floors above, where Colonel Patricia Hayes had infiltrated the command center itself through a route that Tom Chen had identified in the building's original construction blueprints. She moved through the Zephyrian facility like she owned it, avoiding detection not through stealth but through sheer audacity. When she finally reached Commander Vextar's office, she found him hunched over tactical displays, showing attacks across the globe. The crystalline alien looked up in shock as a human in improvised military fatigues calmly walked into his most secure facility. You should probably activate your base alert, Colonel Hayes said conversationally, settling into a chair across from the alien commander. Your perimeter has been completely compromised. Vextar reached for his weapon, but Hayes raised her hand peacefully. I'm not here to shoot you, Commander. I'm here to talk. We have about 20 minutes before your security forces figure out where I am, so I suggest you listen carefully. The Zephyrian commander stared at the human female with a mixture of shock and grudging respect. No enemy had ever penetrated his command center during an active military campaign. How did you get in here? The same way we've been getting into all your facilities for the past 6 months, Hayes replied. We think like humans, and you think like Zephyrians. You defend against the attacks you would make. We make the attacks you would never consider. Vextar's mandibles clicked with frustration. What do you want, human? I want to save both our species a lot of unnecessary killing, Hayes said simply. You came here thinking you'd conquered Earth. Instead, you've gotten trapped in a war you can't win and can't afford to lose. I'm here to explain why. She stood and moved to his tactical display, pointing at the red indicators marking attacks across the globe. Every one of these represents a choice your empire has to make. You can reinforce Earth with more troops, which means weakening your defenses on other worlds. You can continue the occupation with current force levels, which means accepting casualties that will eventually become unsustainable. Or you can escalate to weapons of mass destruction, which means destroying the very planet you came here to exploit. Vextar studied the human carefully. You're offering to surrender. I'm offering to educate you, Hayes corrected. About rule number 1. The alien commander's crystalline eyes narrowed. Explain this rule. Colonel Hayes smiled, and there was something in that expression that made the veteran of 17 planetary conquests feel genuinely nervous for the first time in his career. Rule number 1 is very simple, Commander. It's the most important thing any species can learn about humans, and it's the reason your empire is about to face its first military defeat in 2,000 years. She leaned forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades studying warfare. Rule number 1. Never fight a war with humans unless you're prepared to kill every single one of us. Because we don't know how to quit. Vextar felt something cold settle in his chest. Elaborate. You've conquered 17 worlds, Commander. Every species you've defeated had a breaking point. A moment when continued resistance became more painful than acceptance of defeat. You applied pressure until they reached that breaking point, and then they surrendered. Hayes gestured toward the tactical display. Humans don't have a breaking point. We have something else instead. Spite. When you destroy our cities, we live in the ruins and plan revenge. When you kill our soldiers, their families become soldiers. When you take our resources, we steal them back and use them against you. The colonel's voice hardened. You think you're fighting a post-conquest insurgency. What you're actually fighting is a species that considers dying on our feet preferable to living on our knees. And that, Commander, is a war you cannot win with conventional tactics. Alarms began blaring throughout the facility as Zephyrian security forces finally located the breach in their perimeter. Hayes stood up calmly, checking her watch. I need to go now. Your people will find several small explosive devices throughout this building, but nothing that will cause structural damage. Consider them a demonstration of how easily we can reach you when we choose to. She headed toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Commander? The next time your High Command asks why you need reinforcements to control a primitive world, you tell them it's because you forgot to check whether humans had ever lost a war of attrition against a superior enemy. As Hayes disappeared into the facility's corridors, Vextar realized with growing horror that he couldn't think of a single example in human history where they had. The Zephyrian Empire had made their greatest mistake. They'd assumed that overwhelming force would lead to inevitable victory. They'd never considered the possibility that some species might view inevitable defeat as merely the starting point for a longer, more expensive war. Rule number 1 wasn't just about human stubbornness. It was about the fundamental difference between conquerors who fought for territory and defenders who fought for survival. And the Galactic Empire was about to learn that survival made for much more motivated soldiers than conquest ever could. 1 week after what human historians would later call the global demonstration, Admiral Thisavar stood in the war room of the Zephyrian flagship, studying casualty reports that read more like a military disaster than an occupation mission. The coordinated attacks across Earth had achieved something unprecedented in the Empire's history. They'd made continued conquest more expensive than strategic withdrawal. Summarize the damage. Commander Vextar, the Admiral commanded, his crystalline features reflecting the harsh lighting of the holographic displays. Vextar straightened his forearms, knowing he was about to deliver news that would reshape the Empire's understanding of warfare. Sir, the humans executed simultaneous operations on every inhabited continent. They penetrated our most secure facilities, eliminated key personnel, destroyed strategic supplies, and demonstrated complete intelligence penetration of our command structure. Casualties? 437 dead, over 1,000 wounded. More significantly, they've proven they can reach any target on the planet at will. Our bases are no longer secure. Our supply lines are completely compromised, and our personnel are suffering from what their psychologists call combat fatigue. Admiral Thisavar absorbed this information with the grim expression of a commander facing an impossible situation. What do our strategic analysts recommend? They've identified 3 options, sir. First, complete pacification using orbital bombardment weapons. Second, reinforcement with an additional 3 battle fleets and full siege protocols. Third, Vextar hesitated. Speak freely, Commander. Strategic withdrawal, sir. Reclassification of Earth as a failed conquest and implementation of permanent quarantine protocols. The silence that followed was the sound of 2,000 years of unbroken military expansion coming to an abrupt halt. No world had ever been abandoned after successful initial conquest. No species had ever forced the Zephyrian Empire to reconsider its strategic objectives. Explain the human female's proposal, Admiral Thisavar finally said. Vextar accessed his personal recordings of the encounter with Colonel Hayes. She offered what she called managed disengagement, complete Zephyrian withdrawal in exchange for human agreement, not to develop interstellar travel capabilities for 50 standard years. Preposterous. We don't negotiate with conquered species. Sir, with respect. The humans don't appear to consider themselves conquered. Deep beneath the ruins of Manhattan, Jake Morrison sat in the expanded command center that had grown from a subway maintenance tunnel into the nerve center of Earth's resistance. Around him, representatives from every continent reported on the success of their coordinated operations. The psychological impact has been greater than we hoped, Colonel Hayes reported to the assembled cell leaders. Our intelligence sources inside their command structure indicate significant debate about the cost-benefit analysis of continued occupation. Maria Santos looked up from her communication equipment. We're receiving coded transmissions from human work groups at their mining facilities. Morale among the alien forces is deteriorating rapidly. They came here expecting to police a defeated population, not fight a planet-wide guerrilla war. Tom Chen added his own observations. Their engineering corps is struggling to maintain infrastructure under constant sabotage. Every repair crew has to travel with armed escorts. Every supply convoy requires military protection, and every facility needs round-the-clock security. Jake studied the faces of people who'd transformed from desperate survivors into the leadership of humanity's greatest military achievement. What's our current operational capacity? Growing daily, Colonel Hayes replied. Every successful operation recruits more volunteers. Every alien response that harms civilians creates more resistance fighters. They're trapped in a cycle where every action they take to suppress us makes us stronger. Private Collins, now a seasoned combat engineer, raised a practical concern. Colonel, what if they decide to just destroy the planet? They've got the firepower to turn Earth into a lifeless rock. Hayes smiled with the confidence of someone who'd spent months studying their enemy's psychology. They won't. They invaded Earth because it has value to their empire, resources, strategic location, and a potential labor force. If they destroy the planet, they gain nothing and waste everything they've invested in the conquest. But more importantly, Hayes understood something about the Zephyrian Empire that they didn't understand about themselves. They were bureaucrats with weapons, not warriors with a cause. Every decision was made based on cost-benefit analysis, resource allocation, and strategic efficiency. They'd conquered 17 worlds not through superior courage or determination, but through superior technology applied systematically. Humans had turned their greatest strength into their greatest weakness by making systematic approaches irrelevant. 3 days later, Admiral Thisivar made a decision that would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries to come. Standing before the holographic communication array connecting him to the Empire's high command, he delivered a report that had never been made in the history of Zephyrian expansion. High Command, I am recommending immediate strategic withdrawal from the world-designated Earth. The human species has demonstrated military capabilities that make successful occupation economically unfeasible. The collection of ancient, crystalline faces that constituted the Empire's leadership stared at him with expressions ranging from shock to outrage. Admiral, the Supreme Commanders. Voice carried across space with barely controlled fury. The Zephyrian Empire does not retreat from primitive worlds. Sir, respectfully, this world is not primitive. It's feral. The humans have proven capable of conducting sophisticated military operations without detectable command structures, maintaining supply lines through hostile territory, and coordinating planet-wide resistance using technology we thought we'd eliminated. Admiral Thisivar paused, knowing his next words would define his career and potentially reshape the Empire's expansion policies. More significantly, they've demonstrated something we've never encountered before: the ability to make victory more expensive than defeat. Continued occupation of Earth would require permanent deployment of forces that we need for actual strategic objectives. The humans have turned their planet into a resource sink disguised as a conquest. The debate that followed lasted 17 hours and fundamentally changed the Zephyrian Empire's approach to expansion. For the first time in their history, they added a new category to their target assessment protocols: species too stubborn to conquer cost-effectively. 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood in the ruins of Times Square, watching the last Zephyrian transport ships disappear into the sky. Around him, humans emerged from tunnels and basements and abandoned buildings, blinking in sunlight they hadn't seen in over a year. "Think they'll come back?" Collins asked, studying the sky where alien warships had hovered for so long. Jake considered the question seriously. "Maybe, someday. But if they do, they'll remember rule number 1. Colonel Hayes joined them, looking older but satisfied. "The important thing is that we proved something to ourselves as much as to them. We proved that humans don't surrender just because the odds are against us." As cleanup and reconstruction began across the planet, word spread through both human and alien civilizations about what had happened on Earth. The Zephyrian Empire began including new warnings in their expansion protocols. Detailed analysis of target species' historical responses to superior enemies, evaluation of cultural factors that might influence post-conquest behavior, and most importantly, identification of species that might consider defeat a temporary setback rather than a permanent condition. Other alien civilizations took note as well. Earth was quietly added to a list of worlds that were more trouble than they were worth, populated by a species that specialized in making their enemies regret starting fights. And deep in the archives of the Galactic Library, a new entry was added to the catalog of military wisdom gathered from across the galaxy. Rule number 1. Never fight a war with humans unless you're prepared to kill every single one of them. Because they don't know how to quit. It was a lesson that would influence interstellar politics for generations to come, ensuring that when other species looked at the small blue world in an unremarkable solar system, they remembered that some victories were too expensive to achieve, and some enemies were too stubborn to defeat.